He is a man who needs no introduction, yet he remains a figure of infinite complexity. Abraham Lincoln, the Great Emancipator, the savior of the Union. The humble log cabin lawyer who became America's most revered and perhaps most enigmatic president. His life is the story of a nation forged in fire. He led the country through its darkest, bloodiest chapter, the Civil War, and in doing so preserved the democratic experiment for all time. His words, etched in stone at his memorial in Washington, D.C., have become the secular scriptures of the American Republic, a testament to a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But what they don't always tell you about Abraham Lincoln, what the grand marble statues and the solemn histories often gloss over, is that while he was fighting with every fiber of his being to save the life of a nation, he was fighting a desperate and losing battle to save his own family. That 3 of his 4 beloved sons would die before reaching adulthood. He was a man who bore the grief of a nation on his stooped shoulders, a grief measured in hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers. But he also carried the unbearable private grief of a father who had to bury his own children. This is the little-known, heartbreaking story of Abraham Lincoln's 4 sons. A tale of love, profound loss, and a legacy of sorrow that is as much a part of the Lincoln story as any political victory. In this video, we will tell the complete tragic and often forgotten stories of Robert, Eddie, Willie, and Tad, the 4 sons of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln. Their lives were lived against the backdrop of the most tumultuous period in American history, and their personal sorrows became inextricably intertwined with the nation's own great suffering. This is a story of a family defined as much by profound loss as by monumental greatness. First, we will explore the long, complex, and difficult story of Robert Todd Lincoln, the ambitious and serious eldest, the only son to survive to adulthood, who lived his entire life in the immense and often burdensome shadow of his father's sainthood and his mother's tragic decline. Next, we will revisit the short, heartbreaking life of Edward Eddie Lincoln, the cherished second son whose death in early childhood cast the first long, dark shadow of grief over the young Lincoln family. Then we'll delve into the story of Willie Lincoln, the brilliant poetic soul and the undisputed light of the White House, whose death from illness midway through the Civil War devastated the president and nearly destroyed the First Lady's sanity. And finally, we'll uncover the life of Thomas Tad Lincoln, the rambunctious, free-spirited youngest son who brought joyful chaos to a grieving White House, only to have his own promising life cut tragically short, dealing one final, unbearable blow to his mother. To bring you this deeply historical and emotional saga, we have gone deep into the presidential archives, the vast collection of personal letters of the Lincoln family, and the authoritative Pulitzer Prize-winning biographies of historians like Doris Kearns, Goodwin, and David Herbert Donald. We have pieced together this narrative not just to list facts, but to understand the human heart behind the legend. Stick around to find out how Lincoln's only surviving son lived a life shadowed by the most extraordinary and chilling twists of fate imaginable. Number 4. Robert Todd Lincoln, the survivor's burden. He was the firstborn, the only son of Abraham Lincoln to live a full life, the one who survived. But for Robert Todd, Lincoln's survival meant living forever in the shadow of a martyr, haunted by an almost unbelievable series of tragic coincidences, and ultimately being forced to make an impossible and brutal choice about his own mother. His is the story of a man who achieved great success, but could never escape the orbit of his father's tragedy. Robert Todd Lincoln was Abraham and Mary Lincoln's firstborn son, and ultimately the only one to grow up and live a long life. Born in Springfield, Illinois in 1843, Robert arrived when his father was a rising young lawyer, his political ambitions just beginning to take shape on the Illinois prairie. From the beginning, his temperament was markedly different from the Lincolns. Unlike his rambunctious younger brothers, who would follow, Robert was known from a young age to be serious, reserved, and acutely aware of social standing, a trait inherited from his mother's aristocratic Todd family. He had a bit of a distant relationship with his famous father, not because of any lack of love, but simply due to the collision of circumstances and personality. Abraham Lincoln was a famously indulgent father to his younger boys, letting them run wild in his law office, famously saying, "Let the children have a good time." But with Robert, his firstborn, there was a greater expectation, a more formal distance. Robert was often away at school during much of his teenage years, attending Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, while his father's career exploded onto the national stage, taking him first to Congress and then to the White House. By the time Abraham became president in 1861, Robert was a college student at Harvard, living in a world of East Coast intellectualism, far removed from the day-to-day chaos, the mud-caked boots, and the boisterous energy that defined the Lincoln household. Growing up, Robert sometimes felt overshadowed and pressured by his legendary father. The pressure to succeed was immense. In a moment of deep humiliation, he once failed 15 of the 16 subjects on the notoriously difficult Harvard entrance exam and had to attend prep school for a year to improve his studies. It was a humbling detour that he later joked with a touch of his characteristic dry wit helped spark his father's successful presidential bid, since Lincoln, then on the debate circuit against Stephen Douglas, was too busy campaigning to worry about Robert's academic failings for a while. In 1860, Robert finally entered Harvard, just as his father was elected president of a nation that was tearing itself apart. Imagine being a freshman in college, trying to find your own way, and suddenly hearing that your dad just got elected president of the United States on the eve of a civil war. Robert was proud, but also keenly and uncomfortably aware that every professor, every classmate now looked at him only through the lens of his father's immense and controversial fame. During the Civil War, Robert wanted desperately to contribute to the Union cause. Many of his Harvard classmates were enlisting, and he felt a growing sense of shame and duty. But his mother Mary, already fragile and having lost one son, Eddie, years before, was terrified at the thought of another son going to war. She fought against it fiercely. Finally, in the closing months of the war, a compromise was reached. In January of 1865, Robert joined the Army as a captain on General Ulysses S. Grant's staff. It was a non-combat role, an aide-de-camp, which allowed him to serve without being in the direct line of fire. He was present at Appomattox Courthouse for Lee's surrender. Robert was not on the front lines for long. The war was nearly over by the time he received his commission. In April 1865, as the war shuddered to a close, something unthinkable happened. President Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. That fateful night, Robert had actually been invited to join his parents at the theater. But he declined, telling them he was tired from his journey back to Washington and wanted to rest. This simple twist of fate may have saved his life from the chaos of the assassination. But it put him in a harrowing position. He was awakened late that night with the horrifying news and rushed to the humble boarding house across from the theater where his mortally wounded father lay. Robert arrived in time to stand vigil, to hold his father's hand in his final labored moments, watching the life slowly drain from the man who had just saved the nation. At just 21 years old, Robert became the head of the Lincoln family, suddenly responsible for his shattered, inconsolable mother and his grief-stricken 12-year-old brother Tad. The assassination of his father was the third great family tragedy in Robert's young life. He had already lost 2 younger brothers. After the funeral, he escorted his father's body on the long, mournful train journey back to Springfield for burial. He then resumed his life, determined to step out of his father's colossal shadow, while also somehow honoring his legacy. Robert built a spectacularly successful career. He became a lawyer in Chicago, and by all accounts, he was a very good one, eventually becoming a millionaire attorney for major corporations. In 1868, he married Mary Harlan, the daughter of a U.S. senator, and together they would have 3 children of their own. But Robert's life was far from peaceful. It was marked by eerie, almost supernatural echoes of his father's fate. In fact, history, it seemed, stalked Robert Todd Lincoln in the strangest of ways. A year or two before his father's assassination, Robert had a close brush with death himself. He was standing on a crowded train platform in Jersey City when the press of the crowd caused him to slip, falling into the dangerous gap between the platform and a moving train. At the last second, a stranger grabbed his coat collar and violently pulled him to safety. Robert turned to thank his rescuer and was stunned to recognize him as Edwin Booth, the most famous stage actor in America. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Edwin's younger, less famous brother was John Wilkes Booth, the man who would soon assassinate President Lincoln. In a chilling, almost unbelievable coincidence, the brother of Lincoln's future killer had saved Lincoln's son's life. Robert never forgot that twist of fate. But the dark coincidences were only just beginning. Decades later, Robert was present at not just one, but two additional presidential assassinations. He had followed his father into public service, just a bit serving as the U.S. Secretary of War in the 1880s under President James Garfield. On July 2, 1881, he was walking with President Garfield at a train station in Washington, D.C., when Garfield was shot by a deranged gunman. Robert heard the gunshots and rushed to the president's side, becoming a direct eyewitness to the attack that would lead to Garfield's death. 20 years after that, in 1901, Robert was in the city of Buffalo, New York for the Pan American Exposition. He had just arrived and was walking from the train station when he learned that President William McKinley had been shot at that very same exposition. He even visited the wounded McKinley shortly before that president also died. By this point, Robert couldn't help but feel a dark cloud followed him. He famously remarked with grim humor that there is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present. It was as if being Abraham Lincoln's son had cursed him to be a perpetual witness to the nation's greatest tragedies. Despite these grim events, Robert Todd Lincoln achieved many things. As mentioned, he was Secretary of War under Presidents Garfield and Arthur, and later served with distinction as U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain. He spent most of his later years as a highly successful businessman, notably as the president of the Pullman Palace Car Company, a major railroad car manufacturer. He was by all accounts a smart, hard-working, and honorable man, though much more private and reserved than his folksy, extroverted father. He fiercely protected his father's legacy, going so far as to donate Abraham Lincoln's papers to the Library of Congress, but with the strict condition that they stay sealed until 21 years after Robert's own death. Perhaps he wanted to ensure historians would examine those sensitive documents with cooler heads long after all the immediate players were gone. He also had to shoulder immense and painful family burdens. His mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, suffered from severe mental health struggles in her later life, especially after losing her husband and 3 of her 4 sons. In 1875, Robert made the agonizing and controversial decision to have his mother committed to a sanitarium, believing it was for her own safety. This caused a deep and bitter rift between them for a few years, though they did eventually reconcile. In his own personal life, Robert endured the loss of one of his own children as well. His only son, Abraham Lincoln II, known as Jack, died at age 16 in 1890 from an infection. It seemed the Lincoln family's curse of losing sons would echo into the next generation. Robert Todd Lincoln lived to be 82 years old, passing away in his sleep in 1926. He died in quiet retirement at his estate in Vermont, far removed from the spotlight he had never really wanted. He was the last living link to his father's immediate family. 2 years before he died, an aged Robert attended the dedication ceremony of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. A quiet, dignified man, witnessing the nation deify the father whose shadow he had lived under for his entire life. Number 3. Edward Eddie Baker Lincoln. the first sorrow before he was the president who would save a nation. Abraham Lincoln was just a father. And before the great public losses that would define his life, he and his wife Mary endured a private tragedy that would test their souls and foreshadow the immense grief to come, the death of their second son, Eddie. After Robert the Lincoln's second son was born on March 10, 1846. They named him Edward Baker Lincoln, after a close family friend and political associate. Everyone, however, called him Eddie. Little Eddie was described as a sweet toddler with big blue eyes and a tender heart. Sadly, his life would be heartbreakingly short, but he brought immense joy to his family in the few years he had. Not many detailed stories about Eddie survive from that era, but one precious glimpse comes from a letter Mary Lincoln wrote about him. In it, she described how Eddie adored animals. Once his older brother Robert found a stray kitten and brought it home. Eddie was delighted. He made sure to give the kitten water and fed it bread with his own tiny hands, showing a gentle, caring nature. He protested tearfully when a relative tried to shoo the kitten away. This little anecdote paints Eddie as a loving, sensitive child, even at the age of 2 or 3. Tragically, sometime in 1849, young Eddie fell seriously ill. In an era before modern medicine and antibiotics, childhood illness often turned fatal. Eddie fought for 52 long days against his sickness, as his worried parents did everything they could to care for him. Abraham Lincoln, then a lawyer riding the circuit, was often away from home for long stretches, but he rushed home when Eddie's condition worsened. Despite their prayers and their desperate efforts, Eddie died on February 1, 1850, just a month shy of his 4th birthday. The cause of death was recorded as chronic consumption, which was a period term for tuberculosis, a devastating lung disease. Losing a child is a terrible blow to any parent, and for the Lincolns, this was their first experience with such profound grief. The death of Eddie devastated Abraham and Mary. Neighbors and friends recalled that both parents were heartbroken and wept openly at the funeral. In a letter to his stepbrother around that time, Abraham wrote that Eddie had been sick for 52 days and quietly simply lamented, "We miss him very much." For a man often seen as stoic and reserved in his emotions, Lincoln's simple words speak volumes about his immense pain. Mary Lincoln was so grief-stricken that she secluded herself at home for weeks. A touching tribute to Eddie appeared in the local newspaper 1 week after his death. An anonymous poem titled "Little Eddie" was published in the Illinois Daily Journal. It described a lovely boy called to heaven and offered the comfort that bright is the home to him now given, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. The final line, "Of such is the kingdom of heaven," was so meaningful to the family that it was inscribed on Eddie's tombstone. In those dark days, Abraham and Mary clung to their faith and to each other to get through the loss of their little boy. Eddie was initially buried in a local Springfield cemetery. For the rest of their lives, his parents kept his memory alive. In a sense, Eddie's death also deepened the Lincolns' compassion. Some historians believe these profound personal losses gave Lincoln a stronger sense of purpose and a deeper empathy for human suffering, qualities that would serve him and the nation during the tough years of the Civil War. Number 2. William Willie Wallace Lincoln, the light of the White House. Affectionately called Willie, he was born on December 21, 1850, a hopeful new addition to the family in the same year that Eddie died. He was named after Mary Lincoln's brother-in-law, Dr. William Wallace. And from the start, Willie Lincoln proved to be a very special child, bright, curious, and incredibly kind-hearted. Willie had a lot in common with his father, Abraham. In fact, many who knew the Lincolns said Willie was the child most like Abraham Lincoln in personality. He had his father's thoughtful brown eyes and a calm, sweet temperament to match. Growing up in Springfield alongside his younger brother, Tad, Willie enjoyed a relatively carefree early childhood. There are countless stories of Willie and Tad's mischief at their father's law office. Abraham Lincoln would bring the little boys to work, and they'd promptly start turning the place upside down, spilling ink, knocking books off shelves, giggling as they played. Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, recalled that the boys were absolutely unrestrained, and that their father's good nature was never disturbed by their antics. Abraham would simply smile and let his sons be kids. Willie, in particular, was known to be polite and gentle when not horsing around with Tad. He loved reading and even writing poetry. Impressively, at just 10 years old, Willie wrote a short poem eulogizing a family friend who had died in the Civil War, showing that he shared his father's gift for words and deep reflection. In early 1861, the Lincoln family's life changed dramatically. Abraham Lincoln became president, and the family moved to Washington, D.C. Suddenly, 10-year-old Willie and 7-year-old Tad found themselves living in the White House, a grand mansion that became their new playground. Willie quickly made friends and charmed almost everyone with his warm and cheerful personality. One family friend described Willie as the most lovable boy, bright, sensible, and kind. President Lincoln, burdened with leading the country through a bloody civil war, found great comfort and joy in his sons. He would often take a break from his work to watch Willie and Tad play, or listen to Willie read something he wrote. Those moments of laughter in the midst of war were precious to Lincoln. But in early 1862, a peril lurked in the White House that no one realized until it was too late. Washington, D.C. at that time had poor sanitation, and the White House water supply was likely contaminated. In January of 1862, Willie and Tad both fell gravely ill with what doctors called bilious fever, almost certainly typhoid fever. The two boys came down with high fever's chills and terrible weakness. The Lincoln parents were beside themselves with worry. Abraham juggled running the war effort with sitting at his sons' bedsides every night. Tad the younger eventually began to recover. But to the Lincolns' terror, Willie only got worse. On February 20th, 1862, Willie Lincoln died in the White House at just 11 years old. The Civil War may have raged in the nation, but in that moment, the Lincolns' world fell apart. President Lincoln broke down and wept, saying through his tears, "My poor boy, he was too good for this earth. God has called him home." It was one of the few times anyone saw Abraham Lincoln cry openly. He later admitted, "It is hard to have him die." Mary Lincoln's grief was even more devastating. She collapsed, taking to her bed for 3 weeks, unable to even attend Willie's funeral. The White House was shrouded in mourning. For Abraham Lincoln, losing Willie in the middle of the Civil War was a personal agony added to a national crisis. Those close to him said his face now carried a permanent, deep-seated sadness. He would reportedly visit the cemetery vault where Willie's body lay just to be near his boy again. In her despair, Mary even sought solace in spiritualism, inviting mediums and holding seances in the White House, hoping to communicate with Willie's spirit. Such was the depth of a mother's sorrow. Willie's life, though short, had been full of joy and promise. His death was arguably the greatest personal tragedy Abraham Lincoln ever faced, aside from his own fate. Number 1. Thomas Tad Lincoln, the President's Joy. A Mother's Final Sorrow. Born April 4th, 1853. No one ever called him Thomas. As a baby, his father nicknamed him Tad, short for tadpole because he had a large head and a small body and wiggled around energetically. The nickname stuck for life. Tad Lincoln grew up as the beloved baby of the family, a ball of fire, known for his boundless energy and affectionate nature. Tad had special challenges from birth. He was born with a partial cleft palate which affected his speech. He spoke with a lisp, and sometimes his words were hard to understand. But this never slowed him down. In Springfield, he and Willie were inseparable partners in mischief. When he was 7, he moved into the White House, which he treated as his personal adventure playground. He hitched goats to a chair and rode them through a formal reception. He barged into cabinet meetings. His father, famously patient, allowed it all, famously saying, "Let him run. He'll grow up soon enough." Life turned serious for Tad in 1862 when he and Willie both fell ill. Tad fought off the infection, but he lost his best friend and brother. At just 8 years old, he had to grapple with a profound grief. In the aftermath, Tad became even closer to his father. He became his father's shadow, his constant companion. The bond between President Lincoln and Tad grew incredibly strong in those final years of the war. Tad gave his father a reason to smile amid the sorrows. Then came April 14th, 1865. That evening, Tad, now 12, was at Grover's Theater watching a play when the theater manager stopped the performance to announce that the president had been shot. Tad screamed and burst into tears, crying out, "They killed Papa! They killed Papa!" He was rushed back to the White House while chaos reigned in the streets. He never got to say goodbye. When finally told that his beloved Papa had died, the child was inconsolable. He reportedly said through tears, "Pa is dead. I am only Tad Lincoln now. Little Tad like other little boys. I am not a president's son anymore." After the assassination, Mary, Tad, and Robert left Washington. Tad finally began formal schooling in Chicago. In 1868, Mary, haunted by memories, took 15-year-old Tad to Europe. For nearly 3 years, he traveled and attended school in Germany, and he began to thrive, his speech improving, his confidence growing. By 1871, they returned to the United States, with Tad, now a promising 18-year-old, on the cusp of adulthood. But tragedy was not done with the Lincoln family. Shortly after returning, Tad fell ill with a severe lung ailment, likely tuberculosis or pneumonia. His health declined quickly. On July 15, 1871, Tad Lincoln died in Chicago at the age of 18 in his mother's arms. The news was a final crushing blow for Mary Todd Lincoln. She had now buried her husband and 3 of her 4 sons. Tad, her baby, her companion, in the lonely years after the assassination, was gone. Her spirit was broken. Tad was buried in the Lincoln tomb in Springfield alongside the father and brothers he had so loved. Robert, the sole survivor, was once again left to grieve. Together, the lives of the 4 Lincoln sons tell a story of almost unbearable tragedy. A family that paid a profound and devastating personal price for its service to the nation. One who survived under a heavy burden, and 3 who were lost too soon. They are the forgotten heart of the Lincoln legend. This theme of the children of a great and controversial Civil War figure is something we have explored before on this channel. In a previous video, we examined the brilliant and complex life of Lincoln's great adversary, General Robert E. Lee, whose choices during the Civil War forever shaped the nation and his own family's destiny. We explored the man behind the uniform and the difficult and often debated path he walked after the war. You can watch that essential story by clicking the link right here. And his 7 children had to navigate their own complex legacy in a defeated and transformed South, living with one of the most famous names of their time. We are currently developing a deep dive, Robert E. Lee's 7 Children, The Untold Story. To explore that incredible and important chapter of American history, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.